Good evening and a warm welcome to our panelists and the audience. I'm Professor Sudhir Krishnaswamy. I'm a managing trustee at the Center for Law and Policy Research, Bengaluru. We are delighted to hold this panel discussion titled The Present and Future of Digital Privacy, and to release a comic strip on privacy that was developed by CLPR with a lot of help. Today with me on this panel are Ms. Asta Kapoor, co-founder of the Apti Institute, and Dr. Urvashi Aneja, founder and executive director of the Digital Futures Lab. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to start us off this evening with just a brief description of why we tried a comic strip this time and what were our motivations, what were we trying to do before bringing all of you in. The panelists and I are guilty of writing short and long pieces on privacy law for over a period of time, and we've done both academic work, public writing, and there's a way in which these kinds of interventions seem to travel well up to a point and then seem to run up against blocks. And we thought that rather than write another policy piece or academic intervention in this field of privacy, that we should try and do something else. And a mode of public engagement that might be a little more narrative style and a little more of a story and be insightful, but hopefully engage a wider audience. And that was our motivation getting into this project. And we did this with the support of the Frederick Naumann Foundation, which supported such an initiative. And we thought, let's try and get at this topic in a different way. We had a team that supported it, and people often do credits at the end. I'll do credits right at the beginning. So Preetham and the team at Studio Sideline did much of the visual design and scripting work that with us, with the internal team. And the final visual editing was done by Ananya Patel. At CLPR, it was, these projects tend to take longer than they should, and it's a long-winded engagement. And we had many colleagues who helped in, Kalyani Menon and Varsha Nair when we started, Mansi, Anish, Saha, and Jay Bruna, and Soumya Singh, who's also helped organize this, and Vineet helping pull all of this together. So that was the group. That was the group that put this together, and we said, let's try and have something of a engagement, a conversation with the comic to get us started, and as we put it out for wider dissemination. So let me introduce our panelists today. So that's my bit of the talking. So the panelists are going to do much of the talking here on out. We have Asta Kapoor. Asta Kapoor is the co-founder of the Apti Institute, where she leads the Data Economy Lab. She has a Master of Arts in Social Development from the Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University. And Asta has done a lot of work on a lot of different things that we've had conversations about, but some of her recent work looks at questions of data stewardship, which is a big topic in ongoing discussions, including about AI, and looking at solutions for individual rights protections over data and enabling use for the public good. I'm sure Asa will say more about her work and her responses to this as we go along, but let me introduce Dr. Urvashi Aneja first, and then welcome both of them here. She's the founder and executive director of the Digital Futures Lab. She completed a DPhil in international relations from the University of Oxford, and has done a fair bit of academic work and remarkable reports from the Digital Futures Lab on several issues, but recently on foundational issues around AI sovereignty, on which there's not so much in the comic, but by all means, Urvashi, bring it in as we go along. So in some ways, when we were bringing up this conversation and the and the privacy comic strip, one of the things that struck me is to ask a question about whether privacy is no longer the big issue in town. I mean, I mentioned Urvashi's recent work on AI, and it seems like in some ways that this question seems to fade in some ways in response to some other emerging issues of the time. The way we approached this comic strip, and let me put in two more sentences, was to look at questions of state surveillance, not so much to look at surveillance capitalism, as it's often called, or market surveillance. And we looked at what a potential citizenship score system might look like, especially in an Indian model where entitlements and benefits are closely wound up with a digital welfare state. And we said, is that kind of, there was some early work done on such scores in China, but we said, what would something like this look like in India? Is it even reasonably imaginable in some non-alarmist and proximate kind of way? And that's what we tried to imagine and put together. But let me then start with that prompt and early question to Urvashi first, which is the surveillance and state control through data question still relevant in India, globally? Has it morphed in some way? Should we be thinking about these questions in some interesting new way? How did you come to look at this kind of comic strip? Over to you, Urvashi.
Thanks, Sudhir, and thanks for having me on this show. And, a big congratulations to you and your team for putting together this comic strip, as we've been trying to do some similar work at Digital Futures Lab on trying to create these graphic novels around the harms of generative AI. And it's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to actually translate kind of policy work into storytelling that can speak to multiple audiences. And I think you guys have done a really fantastic job. So thanks for doing that. Um, maybe I want to just pick up on also like two things that you said in your opening remarks and then come to the comic. I mean, one is that this point around kind of, is privacy fading away as a conversation? Are we still talking about it as much? And I think you're absolutely right? I think in some sense it's an unfortunate situation where we are in, where we're so kind of seduced by the potential or promise of AI that we seem to have kind of put privacy on a back burner. And in some sense, with the kind of, by being so seduced by AI, we seem to have also made some kind of Faustian bargain almost, that, hey, we're okay with now a loss of privacy. We're okay with that, and we kind of want to move ahead. And you see that kind of rhetoric, or you see that kind of narrative in just some of the global conferences currently, like the AI for Good conference that just happened in Geneva. There's almost no conversation around privacy. We're talking about many other things. There was a new flavor of the month around public interest AI and so on and so forth, but really nothing on privacy. So I do think it's worrying. It's a concern, and we need to put it back on the table. It's a fundamental right, and again, for that, I think it's great that you guys are doing this work and have put this out. Um, the second point that that I was thinking when you were speaking was that you were talking about how this is not so much about surveillance capitalism, but really about state surveillance and what that means in the Indian context, and whether we need a new vocabulary. To me, one of the things that is concerning is, in some sense, that the acceptance of kind of surveillance capitalism, because of the benefits that it apparently provides to us in terms of convenience or goods or now even development, also kind of legitimizes state surveillance. But there's a slippery kind of slope between the two. And in the minds of people, once you've given away your data to one set of actors and for one set of things, then what's the problem with giving it away to another set of actors, another set of things, right? And I think in a country like India, there is actually a lot of trust in the state, that we'd rather give our data to the state rather than give it to big tech. So I would be wary of kind of separating those two out, and I think we really need to think about how they kind of reinforce and legitimize each other. And then kind of coming to the comic strip, and I'll stop after that. One of the things that really struck me about the way that you all have framed it, and what which I think was great, was that it really kind of reinforced this idea that privacy is a social good. It's not just an individual good. Because people might be making individual decisions about their data, or who gets access to what kind of data, but the impact of that is a transformation in societal norms, which then comes back to bite the individual. But we're talking about a shift in societal norms, and I think that's really important, because very often the privacy conversation is framed only as an individual rights concern, and people say, like, I have nothing to hide, or what's the problem, I'm happy to give out my data. But the line between what is an individual good and a social good, I think, is something that we need to think about, and I thought that came across really strongly in the comic. Obviously other things around kind of convenience, how people are lured in by convenience, the impact of kind of peer pressure. I thought that also came out really nicely in what you've put together, that hey, I'm doing it, why aren't you doing it? And also, again, the slippery slope between kind of seemingly mundane places where we're ready to give up our privacy, like to kind of move quicker in a line, like we see in Digiyatra in like a current context, right? And that slippery slope between something like that, and then when it actually has an impact on people's access to something like healthcare and a right to life. So I thought those things were conveyed really well in the comic, and also really important from a kind of public engagement perspective, right? To kind of highlight what the tensions are when we think about things like convenience and peer pressure. Let me pause there. I mean, there's a lot more that I could say on also how we might want to reframe the conversation currently, but I'll let Asta come in and then jump back in later.
Yeah, I'm just going to bring Asta in, but if I can just amplify a point that you made, Urvashi, because we thought about this at some length, which is, often in the privacy conversation, we are accused of distorting or, making too much of noise, the small things that you are asked to do, or small bits of information that we are asked to give up on an ongoing basis. And we don't take this accretive view, right? When you add this all up together, then it adds up to something which is a altogether different kind of beast. And we are seeing some of that in India today, not in a sort of dystopian sense necessarily, but in some sense. And we were trying to capture that it's not always about big privacy decisions that we make, that there are a lot of these small things that add up to a particular view on the privacy question. But over to you, Asta. What caught your eye, and where do you think this kind of surveillance control questions are in India today?
Thank you so much for having me, and also to echo a lot of what Urvashi said. I think much like everybody else who's in the business of creating knowledge, we're also struggling to find ways to keep people's attention. I think that the comic does that so wonderfully. It's pithy, it's precise, and I think it gives what is a really complex discourse, a very accessible and personal way of understanding, and really appreciate that. And I think this is going to be something that we'll also be sharing across all of our work. So thanks to you and your team for doing that. As Urvashi was speaking, and as you were, I was thinking of also this idea of privacy, and is it still relevant? I often say it's not, and but I'm realizing increasingly, I think what we have lost is the battle for privacy through the frame of personal data protection. I think privacy is very much still on the table, because I think how we think about, models being trained on our personal documents in Google Drive, right? Like that is still an invasion of privacy. It is not in the way that we have so far understood the discourse of personal data protection, right? And I think that this sort of line between types of data is what is causing a lot of muddling, at least in the sort of discourse around protection, because I think that we have been so extended around personal data protection that we haven't necessarily unbundled moments of privacy very well. I also think that in that context, there is obviously in India a foregone conclusion about like, oh, if you're happy to put your name in an email, then why wouldn't you give it to the government? There's obviously the carrot approach of efficiency, of access. And in very many instances, I think that people haven't necessarily been given a choice. This has always been presented as the only way. Giving your data to whether it's the government or big tech is the only way, and that is how you'll get your benefits. That is how you'll get access to Facebook or whatever else you desire, and so you do it. And I think that what we need to start thinking about is creating a little bit of that alternative, in terms of what is the alternative to these data extractive relationships. And I think that, to pull on what Urvashi said about public trust, I think, yes, India does have some of the highest trust in governments, and therefore we don't question it. But part of that is also the fact that the state comes in the form of a mandate, or in the form of coercion, right? Or in the form of welfare. So the state has many faces, and therefore the ability to negotiate with the state is quite complex. With private platforms, you may even, if you are so strong, may even want to opt out and say, I don't need a Facebook account, or I'm not going to use these platforms. But the negotiation with the state doesn't offer any alternatives or the ability to opt out. And I think it's in that relationship that we find ourselves extremely, I wouldn't say, I don't want to use the word exploited, because the state is a useful institution in the net of it, but I think unable to necessarily come together and ask for different things. And we've seen this in the context of, so you and I first spoke about the Aadhaar Act, right? Like that, what was that, 2017? And now we are in, many years later, in the context of data protection. Data protection legislation also allows things like, public data is allowed to be processed. So I think that these kinds of sort of boxes we make for categories that make data seem governable are where we're losing lots of the battles. And I think we have to start thinking about use more critically. I think we have to start thinking about our ability to negotiate, thinking about alternatives to consent, which is not a meaningful instrument at all. And I think that if we do approach privacy through all of these different threads and not through the sort of myopic view of personal data protection, I think we might still be in for a fight, because I think that the new AI-driven technologies do offer a newer ability to negotiate on privacy again.
Oh, interesting. So I thought that and I know that Urvashi and you have been working on the AI question at length, and I'm glad to hear that touch of optimism, Asta, that you closed with, that maybe AI will open up new modes of negotiation. But I want to go back to what you mentioned about Aadhaar and the early conversations about privacy. And if we go back to 2017, and the Puttaswamy case, there's an ironic sense in which, and people working in various areas of law and activism in India recognize this, that the day you get your right is the high point of the issue, and if we look back now at Puttaswamy, it's not a decade, but it almost seems some time ago. There was a sharp recognition that this was important in Puttaswamy, and then 8 years later, we've sort of drifted. We have gone through many cycles of this debate, and I'll just mention a few and then ask to come back to you, because I think your work on data stewardship and so on prompts one mode of response. One expectation was that we would get early legislation, that, okay, we have a right to privacy and something like the Right to Education and the Right to Education Act, that a legislation would quickly follow and it would concretize all of this. None of that happened, right? So the statute took a long time. We got some partial version of it in the DPDP Act in 2023, but that was a good 6 years later. So we didn't get some strong legislation on the topic. Simultaneously, we explored the idea that maybe this could all be worked out through some private ordering, some kind of privacy by design, or some kind of tech protocols version of privacy, right? And there was some enthusiasts for that position, and people have worked in those fields. And I'll just mention one last kind of strategy. And the last kind of strategy that I think has played out in this field is this complete infusion of the idea that the digital welfare state is the future, right? So we have many versions of this argument. We call them DPIs in one version of that argument. We call it the seamless digital welfare and all of that in some other version of the argument. But I'll just mention these three, the absence of legislation, the kind of the widespread rollout of digital welfare, and the kind of the positive sense about DPIs and that entire range of intervention, and the privacy by design tech protocol models have kind of occupied the space for some time. So I've given you my very quick summary of where we've gone from 2017. Artha, how do you look at it? What are you more optimistic about, or am I getting this wrong?
No, I don't think you're getting it wrong. I think that the optimism is just necessary to continue to do the work that we do. Urvashi and I were just chatting before you joined to be like, maybe distance is good. Maybe we just sort of like all take a break and come back with a fresh pair of eyes. And I think that I think you're right. I think that we really delayed the DPDP. Everybody knows, right? Like the law was written whenever it was, and now passed this year or came into played this year, and now suddenly all of that you're reading is no longer relevant because you're dealing with monsters you don't fully understand and cannot govern in the way that the law is. And which is why I said like the personal data part of it is like something that we need to start thinking much more about. I also think that there is absolutely, I think the complexity scale of India lends itself very well to a digital solutionism, with particularly on welfare. We've all heard the numbers in terms of leakages and exclusion and things like that. We all grew up on those kinds of stories. So of course, when you have the technology to which sort of dazzles you and says we'll reach money to where you are and we'll reach people to where they are, etc., etc., all of that seems like a very important narrative. But we also know that like all of this, and I think that to me this becomes a question of like how we're using a lot of these systems, because on one end we are, like I said, in very data extractive relationships, particularly with the state. And this is an example I talk about all the time, which I find very amusing, is that but also horrifying, is that when the lockdown was announced and we had all of this migrant labor moving from Bombay and Delhi, the trains were lost because we actually didn't know where to send these people, right? So we knew points of origin, we didn't know destination points. And that is because this was not a data driven thing, even though we have welfare data and we have Aadhaar data and we have all kinds of other sort of social schemes and welfare data, but we can't still use this data in any kind of meaningful way to provide people even things like, for those brief moments, many states had to actually do universal welfare, and particularly on PDS, because we didn't know how to do targeting when things are in flux, right? So is the digital infrastructure actually working in a way that is enabling people to access welfare when they need it the most? And I think those are the types of questions we need to start asking. Of course, like I think that the question on privacy by design is also something that we've been hearing. There's privacy enhancing technologies. Even in the DPDP, we've been back and forth on data localization, for instance. We have a framework on consent managers. So there are all of these instruments that are seemingly supposed to empower individuals and maybe communities even on having better control and agency about data that is being generated by them on platforms. But I think the problem, and this is because I'm not a lawyer, so I never find solace in the law, is that I think that we are looking to create a much sort of broader movement around privacy. Many years ago, we had done a piece of work called Reclaim Your Privacy, which was an online campaign to help people understand why privacy was important. And what we realized is that this is actually not something that people like think of as personal harm at all, like loss of data and loss of agency over data, because for whatever reason it is not embodied. And I think that was also, by the way, in like 2018 or 19, so it's been a while. But I think now increasingly you realize in the face of harm, and I'm talking about the enormous amount of frauds that India is currently, and I know there's, we will talk about that later, is that I think people are finally understanding modalities of digital vulnerability and what loss of data actually means. We're also in a situation where we have data brokers selling our personal data, whether it's the phone number you gave to the restaurant or your Swiggy data or whatever else it is. This is all being monetized and brokered and sold to scamsters. And what we're seeing is now a gentle and slow pushback against some of the digital technologies. So I read in the paper that in Bangalore, merchants don't want to accept UPI anymore. So the trust that we have been sort of mining, trust in public services, trust in public delivery, trust in the government, is slowly getting fragmented and frayed, because now the technologies we was told would work in our favor are actually the ones that are slowly crumbling. And so you all see, like in like Nagpur and Jhansi and all of these places where scams are abundant, you see big customer whatever warning posters on UPI. So I feel like this is again like on an ending on an optimistic mode. I think that in some ways the reckoning of the digital infrastructure is upon us, and again a moment for us to try to find ways in which we can reclaim and renegotiate the terms of our privacy right now, because I think there is a lot of attention on security, there's a lot of attention on resilience, and therefore we can start talking about what it means for individuals and communities, and not just for platforms which are also bleeding money on this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm Asta. I want to come back to the question of data stewardship, but let's talk about those kinds of other models of organizing data flows more generally. But I'll save that up for a little later, and I hope you'll take some time to tell us where you think that's going. But Urvashi, are you optimistic about the AI turn, and is that going to lead to a renegotiation of the privacy question, or is there some other bright hope that we must look to?
Yes and no, right? I mean, as Asta was speaking, I was definitely more optimistic than I was before Asta was speaking. So she's already converted one person, so that's great. Like I think, when I think about privacy, I sometimes think like, the vocabulary of privacy doesn't actually adequately capture what's at play here. And the vocabulary doesn't do service to what we are really fighting for. And when I think about privacy, I actually find like, Nissenbaum's idea of kind of contextual integrity to be quite powerful, which is really talking about what are kind of appropriate data flows within a society, right? What are appropriate kind of information flows within a society? And thinking of it in those terms, I think gives us a little bit more sway to also think that what is appropriate might change, right? It may not remain the same. So like Asta was saying, we might have lost the battle on personal data. We might need to rethink the categories of data itself in the context of AI. And I think that, if we start, and I agree with Asta, but where I would differ, and I don't think Asta and I actually disagree on this, but I think if we start with kind of looking at it from the kind of categories of data, we end up back in this kind of very legalistic kind of space, and where we need to, and where only a certain people can be part of the conversation. We're trying to slice up data in different ways. But instead, what we really need to focus on is like, what do we think is appropriate in terms of how my information should flow? Right? And what is my expectation of that? And how is that expectation being kind of violated or upheld in the current context? And so I think that is a more kind of powerful framing. And there I think we have a conversation to really not make this about data anymore. or not make this about AI anymore, not make this about technology anymore, but really bring it back to our relationships with people, and where we have an opportunity to bring in a larger kind of public into this conversation. And if you frame it like that, then I feel like a lot of people would be quite concerned about what is happening in the context of AI, where the ways the information flow in the context of AI, whether it's around kind of generative AI, even before, would defy many people's expectation of how that information is flowing. And they would want to redirect that data in a different way, or redirect that information flow in a different way. So I think that's kind of one part of it. So I think, yes, like there is space for optimism, but that optimism we'll be able to expand that space if we also change the vocabulary with which we're approaching this. Also, not approach it through kind of technical concepts, but really bring it back to people, expectations, need, so on and so forth. And here, I think there's also sometimes a little bit of laziness in how we talk about AI. We talk about kind of AI for social good or AI for humanity and so on and so forth. Like that, then that takes us to this kind of very like cost benefit, right? Like surely you should be okay with giving up your data because AI is going to help us in so many different ways. And why are you opposing the use of AI? And I think that's some of the work that like Asta I know has been doing, is to really to think about, and which was like the migrant worker example was so powerful, is to really think about what are those particular kind of uses or cases in which data is actually useful, and what are the flows where the flow of data would from between certain actors would actually be useful, and to really get very specific about that conversation, right? Not to leave it in this kind of ether of AI for good or AI for healthcare, AI for all. And that's the space that I think we need to start kind of populating and having these conversations. I'm not as optimistic as Asta, and we'll come to like the data stewardship conversation later as well. And you'd mentioned, for an example, so the issues around kind of consent managers being one of the artifacts through which we're resolving this, and also privacy by design, so on and so forth. And I think those are kind of promising directions, but I think we also need to look at the kind of political economy of that ecosystem. So with like consent managers, what's really the business model there? What's the revenue model? Who are these actors? How are they really making money? I'm yet to see kind of convincing examples where consent managers work well at scale over a period of time, because of just the, who foots the bill and how. So we have to bring in the kind of political economy conversation into the solution space the same way we have now started bringing it into the problem space.
That's an excellent way of shaping that conversation, and it helps place the DPDP Act in context. You referenced Professor Nissenbaum's work on contextual integrity, and we had the advantage of her presenting some of this work at the National Law School last year. And what was clear was, I mean, not only is it textured and practical in its orientation, right? It's not just a philosophical spin on the concept of privacy. It's a very pragmatic, situated kind of working version of privacy, right? And you're absolutely right that if we could think in these ways, that we would make a lot more progress than to just articulate an abstract privacy claim. But the DPDP Act, and I'll just move us into that and just say a little bit of how I've come to see the Act. Whatever it is, Urvashi, it's not contextual integrity, right? And the DPDP Act is completely context neutral. It pays no attention to location, to you imagine that we could draft in a way that reflects the political economy of data givers and data takers. There's none of that in the DPDP Act. It imagines a model of radical agency. We are all free agents. We may consent to give up some information should we choose to. And then we put some modest fiduciary responsibilities on those who take our data. And then we introduce some model of purpose limitation, but not one that's too rigid, and with a fair bit of exemptions. And the state, so long as it is doing welfare and entitlement, might step out of these obligations. And private parties that assist the state to deliver welfare may also step out of these obligations. And, I mean, one of the things we did as a sort of thought experiment is to say and we started doing this comic strip before many of these took shape, and then we labored through it. And we had this great advantage. We said, oh, so what's changed now? I mean, we imagine this context. Does the DPDP Act stop any of the things that we are trying to imagine and set out? And the the sort of reasonable response is no. Much of what we're not too dated. We thought we'd be so dated, and the law has gone on, and this would not seem right. And then we go back to it and look at it today, and it squarely fits. Our legal framework would allow this. We could go on and do all of this, right? So my sense there is that this model, a consent-based model, sees data being exchanged, places all of us as responsible agents giving up data in some reasonable exchange. Model of privacy just doesn't have strong default expectations, right? And that we've not been able to shift at all. And we were thinking about the DPDP Act and the DPDP rules in this way. I'm sure there are more optimistic framings, but Asta, do you want to how have you looked at the act? And I know that it's been a long tortured act, many versions. We have one version now, and we have draft rules now. I mean, just generally looking at this framework, what excites you, or is there something that bothers you?
A lot that bothers me. But I think so, when the latest version, the act came out, I was actually quite excited because it has the right to delegate and it has consent managers. And I was saying that we should set up a consent manager and aggregate consent and just sit on it. So not consent to any, so do not consent manager. And I think that's where some of the stewardship points that you also brought up, which is that it assumes that we're all, in a position to give informed consent, whatever shape and form that takes. And that consent and once consented, you just sort of decide for posterity forever that this data is now in use and we have nothing to do, even though there is some mechanism of revocation, but who knows how that works, right? So I think that in this context, the model of data stewardship actually becomes really important because we feel that there's a lot of work that we at Aapti Institute have done on this over the last 5 years on how can we create collectives that are in a position to pool consent or pool data to collectively consent, and so that we have the ability to negotiate, so that we have the ability to, where necessary, delegate, and decide that maybe somebody else is more able to think through some of the concerns around data use and data processing, and will safeguard my interests. And so a lot of work obviously has been done around these trusted intermediaries, data stewards, fiduciaries, which is where all of this came from in any case, to see if there are governance structures that we can create. One of the ones that has been researched a lot, and we also did a lot of research on this, was data trusts. We unfortunately think that those don't work because of that complex legality around it, right? Claim making is hard, setting them up is hard, and in the context of India, they may not work as well. So the model of stewardship that we are most extended on is the idea of data co-ops, where we think that because cooperatives already pool labor and capital, there is an opportunity to pool data as well. And with the new consent framework, I think there may be some play around using this consent management framework along with a cooperative to see if we can manage collective consent in a meaningful way. I haven't fully worked out how the offline governance system and the online consent managers techno-legal approach is going to work together. But that's the part that I am excited about. We don't have, unfortunately, the right to port. However, consent managers do create a system through which we can maybe port data from one fiduciary to another, because in the EU, we've seen the right to data portability, which was pronounced and given as a very useful instrument that workers, for instance, have used to port data from a ride-hailing app into a worker-owned data trust, right? So I think that there is some room to play. I think we have to be creative. Obviously, this is not something that has been set up for models of data stewardship and collective governance. But I think that it gives a little bit of slack, knowingly or unknowingly, to create some models. I don't think anybody has done it so far, but I think if there was a smart union, for instance, that had, say, 5,000 members, they could start to think of themselves as consent managers, because you can't see data, but you can see consent, right? Which is fine. That is sufficient enough to start to think about it as a collective action starting point.
That's great, Asta, but if I can do a quick follow-up before I bring Urvashi in. So just three quick things. So is the DPDP Act accommodating enough? If you were to change something, what would you change? Second, is there a jurisdiction that you like, that you see the most progress, that we should all be looking at and studying carefully? You mentioned the EU briefly, but is that the jurisdiction of choice? And third, do you see this happening sectorally, in the sense, do you see it happening, say, first in a place like health, where we have kind of high risk, high value information, or do you see this happening in sort of a low risk context? Do you have a sort of sectoral sense of where the action might be?
Sectorally, I think we will need sectoral regulators, right? Because I think the health sector, for instance, even in India, has such a long and potentially rich tradition of data governance and patient data rights, which we have not accommodated for at all in the DPDP, right? DPDP is very, I mean, we took away definitions of sensitive data as well, right? So I think the document was watered down so it could pass. And so I think that it leaves a lot to be desired, and we lost many battles as a result of that. I think the haste, and you made this point earlier, is that it took so long to get it done that by the time it came, everyone was like, just sign off, let's go, right? At least we will have something. And so I think as a result of that, there were many battles that we lost. We lost the right to data portability. I think that should be enunciated, right? I think that we lost some of the definitions around harm. We lost definitions a little bit around what is sensitive data. And so I think we lost a lot, and that, if possible, over time should be changed or claimed and amended. I think we will need sectoral regulators. I think that this broad brush view on data is not going to work at all. And I think that, again, in the context of AI, we're suddenly seeing that it is not like harm doesn't come just from personal data. And so even as you're thinking about privacy and trying to prevent harm from data use, you don't have any jurisdiction in that. And I think that the EU is interesting. I know a lot of people think of it as very like highly, deeply regulating, but I think that some of the stuff that they've done, obviously around the Data Governance Act, but then also more recently about the EU AI Act, which I'm sure Rishi can talk more about, is I think fairly forward-looking legislation. I think that it's interesting, and I think that there's a lot to learn from it. But again, like I said, I'm not so. I think that the jurisdiction in India has just taken so long that we need to think of much more sort of community-led mechanisms. I think it needs to be a combination. A lot of people draw parallels on privacy and data rights from the labor movement. And I think as in the labor movement, there were many factors that came together. I think we need to think of what does movement making around digital rights looks like. And I'm very optimistic that institutions such as the cooperative model are maybe where some of that value lies.
Fantastic. So Urvashi, you mentioned that you would say something about data stewardship. I'm not sure whether that was an optimistic or less than optimistic take, but also about AI, and whether you think the DPDP Act survives the AI challenge, or is it just neutral to the AI question? Over to you, Urvashi.
I think the kind of work that Asta and folks at API are doing, and the push to kind of think of data cooperatives as one way of kind of collective action and a form of digital rights. I think we need more of that kind of work. I think it's really powerful. I think that, I'm less optimistic, and also maybe just to kind of play the devil's advocate so that we have two kind of opposing views on this for the purpose of our listeners. I feel like the point that I was going to say around kind of data stewards, and if we think about the DPDP, one of the things that it can also do is kind of access data from data stewards, right? From data fiduciaries. The government can say, I want access to that data. So there is, on one hand, a kind of movement towards kind of collective action, bringing together these data cooperators, but we're also potentially, if we don't look at the legal context and the political context in which this is happening, also creating data pools which can then be accessed by more powerful actors, whether those actors are the state or that actor is a kind of big tech company or so on and so forth, right? So I think we need to kind of zoom out a little bit also and look at what role these kind of initiatives play in also reifying or kind of consolidating or legitimizing a certain kind of trajectory of governance and a certain kind of trajectory of the datafication of our lives, right? And so that's the point I was going to make around kind of data stewards, that we need to keep that analysis alive at the same time. And while I think, like folks like all of us are keeping that analysis alive, and we're very well aware of the kind of positionality of the work that we do, what I do worry about is like in the kind of, this is something that Asta probably agrees with also, that in the kind of funding ecosystem for civil society, in the pursuit of solutions, right, such as data cooperatives and many others, the funders have kind of taken their pedal off the basic issues around kind of privacy, around kind of, is this the kind of innovation trajectory we want to go to in the first place, right? Is this going to contribute to a kind of consolidation of big tech power? What does this mean for the kind of hollowing out of the state, so on and so forth? Like those bigger picture questions sometimes I think get lost as we're fighting the immediate battles, right? And those immediate battles need to be fought as well. So keeping that kind of balance in our kind of work, I think is the real struggle, right? And that's the point that I was going to make around the kind of data stewardship and other such spaces as well. On the question that you asked about AI and the DPDP, I would argue that it's not a data protection act, right? It's a data access, so it's a data sharing. That's what it really does. It creates a framework that allows you to access as much data as you want with almost no safeguards at all. And so in that sense, it's a framework that is very, very conducive to more and more AI and to enable so-called kind of, I think some of the rhetoric behind it also was that we need to democratize the AI ecosystem. We need to ensure that local players and local actors and local companies also have access to Indian data so that they can compete on a kind of global stage, and the whole AI ecosystem is not just run by big tech players alone. So that's what it does. It enables more access, right? And again, zooming out a little bit, yes, for sure, we need to create an ecosystem which is a more democratized AI innovation ecosystem. And we need to kind of ensure that local players have access to data and we're not completely in a kind of big tech universe. But, we've been doing a lot of work looking at the kind of political economy of the open source AI ecosystem, for an example. And one of the things that we see is that many of these smaller players who are kind of supposedly building AI for good solutions, whether it's for healthcare or for agriculture or so on and so forth, eventually when rubber meets the road, they don't actually have a very good business model. There isn't a very good revenue model for building AI for healthcare. There isn't a very good business model for building a chatbot for farmers, right? There isn't a paying customer at the end of the line. And so their kind of monetization strategies are twofold. Either they kind of monetize that data by selling it directly to kind of data brokers that Arth had mentioned in the beginning, or then they kind of sell out to big tech companies. That's the game plan, right? That's the vision in some sense, right? And I think a lot of this also has to do with the kind of funding that they have available to them. So when we talk about AI, it's not so much whether the AI is good or not, right? But it's also about what is the kind of capital that is available to these companies. And if you have a kind of venture capital is the model that is going to be supporting the AI for good ecosystem, then the push from the VCs is to kind of capture as much of the market as possible and to scale as quickly as possible. And the culture within a startup there is to really cash out, right? To cash out and move on ASAP so that the founders can make their money. And that disincentivizes some of the good that even if the technology was great, the technology could result in. And so, what I'm saying might seem like a bit of a digression, but why I'm putting this on the table is to say that if we don't look at all of these kind of issues around incentives and money flows and so on and so forth, some of the really great work we're trying to do in terms of ensuring that that we can use data as a tool for collective action, that we can leverage AI for societal benefit, etc. It, in the worst case, it might backfire, but in another case, unless we sort out all these other pieces of the pie, we are kind of trading off too much in terms of the datafication of our society, right? By looking at these piecemeal kind of solutions. So that's the kind of roundabout discussion I wanted to kind of flag on kind of stewardship, and then link it back to the regulatory question in AI.
Yeah, thanks, Urvashi. I'm just thinking through, the earlier conversations we had about data sovereignty and the data localization debate. And now we seem to be having a conversation about AI sovereignty, and everyone wants to buy NVIDIA chips and so on, right? So how have you looked at these conversations? I'm not saying that the DPDP Act necessarily has something to say about this, but I know that your recent work has focused on the AI sovereignty question. What does AI sovereignty mean apart from the the ownership of compute and the generation of local models? Is that what we understand, or does it also have percolate to the data layer and that who can work with our data kind of question? I'm just curious. I'm less familiar with the topics. Might be something of a naive question, but over to you, Urvashi.
No, thanks for that. I mean, the work the recent report that you're referring to that we put out on AI sovereignty really came from a place of frustration, because there was so much conversation about, AI, India needs to become sovereign. We need to build our own large language model. We need to, compete with the Chinese and so on and so forth, right? So it was really to say like, okay, what are we really talking about here, and what does sovereignty mean? And I actually think that, in the context of AI, and probably in the context of many other things, there's really no such thing as sovereignty, right? Like if you think about the AI stack, and you go all the way down to the kind of hardware level, or even go one step further down to the kind of critical minerals that go into building that hardware, there's no such thing as sovereignty. You cannot have complete sovereignty, right? So I think what we're talking instead about is autonomy in decision making, right? That I think is a more important framing rather than the sovereignty framing. So you want autonomy in decision making, and if we kind of look at this at the level of the state, I would then imagine that autonomy in decision making, when we're thinking about the state vis-a-vis other actors and in a kind of geopolitical context, is actually an instrument of foreign policy, right? It's question of like, what is the kind of foreign policy you have, and what are the kind of relations and the negotiations you have with other states, rather than building your own stash, right? That's not where that kind of autonomy will come from. So the report that we kind of put out, that was one of one of the things that ways in which we wanted to reframe this conversation, that this is the kind of foreign policy conversation around sovereignty, and how do you maintain autonomy in an interdependent world, rather than kind of building your own technological capabilities and having this misplaced notion that you can build them kind of end to end. And especially where India is currently in its kind of development journey, that seems like a 25-year-old goal, a 25-year goal, or like a 30-year goal, and that's being generous, I think. But I think the other part of the sovereignty question, when it comes to autonomy, and it really comes back to the data question, is similar. It's the autonomy in deciding where your data goes and who's able to use your data and what that data is for. I think it's less about like having, I want it localized in India, or I want it to be stored XYZ, right? That's less of the conversation. It's more about having that agency in deciding those data flows. And that goes back to something that I think you had mentioned earlier, or Astad mentioned earlier, is that how much agency do we really have when our access to kind of public services is dependent on giving up data, right? I mean, in India, even the kind of development discourse is that you're going to be rich because you have data, right? And you can use your data to kind of trade in public services or buy kind of public services. And that seems to be the kind of development paradigm that we are in right now. Not that the state is going to provide services, not that we're going to build institutions that provide services, but instead that because you have data, you have the ability now lift yourself out of poverty or to be able to exercise services. So the broader paradigm is also not one of actual agency, and that's I think the piece that we need to recenter.
Thanks for that, Urvashi. I really liked the part of your report that went into the hardware stack and the materiality of minerals and so on and so forth. We generally don't talk about technology in a material sense at all, and the report took us there. The two things in the DPDP Act, and I remember now going back to early conversations about Aadhaar, were that, look, if we don't have strong purpose limitations, and if we don't have very tight regulation of secondary markets, that we're going to end up with really perverse consequences, right? And there were some of us who said this publicly and wrote publicly about this. And we were often, even if we were in those rooms, we were seen as doomsayers. And I think that the conversation has somewhat turned around the cyber fraud, online scams question, though there is still very little public understanding of how pig butchering scams are actually possible, right? How are these digital arrest scams possible? Because they seem to know so much about you, and they seem to know pretty accurate and location specific and relation specific and bank account numbers and everything else that might be seen as sharply personal information. And it's I don't want to suggest that India is somehow special, that these scams occur around the world, but India seems to have its fair share, if not more than its fair share, of these scams. And how have you come to see this? I mean, this seems to be, at least in my mind, the first moral panic, the way that criminologists write about that criminal law develops through moral panics. And this is the first real moral panic around privacy, right? But it's not seen as a privacy problem even today. It's seen as a sort of a, let's tackle the criminals who do these kinds of scams kind of problem. How have you looked at this, Asta, in the first instance? Have you had to work with these kinds of issues in some way, or do you have a take on where this might take us in the near future?
Yeah, so we did 2 years of work on the idea of digital trust, which particularly for women in India, and we built this huge ontology to understand all the bits and bobs that go into the trust. And we showed this ontology to a privacy researcher who was like, each of these is exactly how scamsters also, go about getting people. So, everything we said about familiarity, everything we said about confirmation, and all of this is like many different metrics. But yes, so short answer, yes, we have been looking at this particularly from the problem of the fact that scams are the biggest deterrent in adoption, and particularly for women. And we've been trying to unbundle access and look at the role of offline intermediation in the context of access. So scams do come up, and with it also all of these sort of like home-based solutions to avoid scams in the way that it happens. And I think what we're realizing is just the complexity of it. And so you're absolutely right. I don't think that we think about this as a resilience question at all, because we've been so digital or solutionist in our approach in the context of India that we never thought about resilience. It was like, oh, give everybody a phone in their hands and put everything online, digitalize this and digitalize that, and things are going to be fine. But we never thought about resilience. And a lot of that, and maybe Urvashi, this is the business model, scams as the business model for the digital ecosystem, because I think the numbers are absurd. I think that it's 7,000 crores over the last 5 months. So if that's not democratizing capital, I don't know what else is. But I think what we are realizing is just the fact that we never build the platforms or the people up for resilience, right? We only built them up to be users of these technologies. And therefore, Nobody has thought of actually building trust mechanisms that go beyond adoption. Nobody has built trust mechanisms that are about grievance redressal, for instance, simple things like that. And I think that's also where a lot of the problems lie. And maybe people are understanding privacy, but also the burden of privacy is back on the individuals, right? So when you think about all the campaigns and things, it's about you and I stopping to do this, and you and I stopping to do our, UPI based transactions, and the whole Jago Grahak Jago and consumer sensitization level of campaigns is, again, the onus of staying safe is on the individuals. Products are not to be questioned because they built amazing products. Policy is doing its own thing. I know that like the I4C has been set up and there's, some coordination mechanisms around this. But again, the burden of safekeeping your data, the burden of making sure that you're not scammed is all on the individuals. And therefore, I think, which is what I was saying, is that we are in no position to negotiate unless we think of it as a much more collective action problem. I don't have fully baked thoughts on what collective action in the context of fraud looks like, but I do think that there are opportunities where people lived experiences, shared experiences, those can be aggregated. People can come together to understand where the vulnerabilities of frauds are. We know from our work around women, which is that women who are in self-help groups and cooperatives have less chances of getting defrauded, because you can literally just ask your friend, is this okay or is this not? Whereas if you are living more atomized lives, then you are more likely to get defrauded. So there is something to be said about an offline collective ecosystem that needs to be built as a way of safeguarding privacy online. And particularly for women, we realize that that's extremely important, because that's where a lot of the vulnerability lies, and people are not able to negotiate their online lives and online transactions in this atomized way. So like I said, like not fully baked thoughts, but this is the direction that we've been thinking about in the context of fraud, which is, how do you think of offline intermediation? How do you think of more collective action?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned collective action, but at this point, your recourse seems to be personalized, right? I mean, the response of the state is that you be cautious and you be you take care, is the kind of position that we seem to be taking. In one sense that we imagined in the comic strip, a sort of a public denial of welfare kind of dystopia. We never imagined a privatized digital arrest. And in a way, it speaks to an overweening state that does intrude quite heavily using the criminal law, which is why digital arrest is the sort of the mode and the model in India. But Urvashi, were you looking at any of this, and did you get a sense that the digital arrest will finally bring privacy to the center of public conversation?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what, Asta was saying earlier also, that maybe we are at a kind of inflection point here, or we have an opportunity here at least, because, the violation of privacy has hit home now, right? People see the points of vulnerability, and there's like kind of, what you were saying, a kind of moral panic. And so I think there is an opportunity here for sure, right? The worry is, of course, that if we look at is the kind of discourse around it, right? Where the discourse is that you didn't protect yourself enough, like Asta was mentioning, or the discourse is like, oh, this is happening to elderly people, they don't really know what's happening, or this is happening to women, and then the elderly people and women are not part of like the target group for kind of tech policy decision making, right? They're not the focus group. And so the fact that it's happening to these kind of happening in these spaces of marginalization and vulnerability already becomes a way to kind of sidestep or ignore the fact that these things are happening, right? So that's the danger, of course. But at the same time, I do think it's becoming so mainstream, and the concern is now so widespread that there is an opportunity here. And to echo what Asta is saying, we need to get to a point where you are protected despite your capacity, right? Not because of your capacity to protect yourself. And that's the state we are in right now, where you're protected it because of your capacity, not because of the way the technology is designed in the first place. So yeah.
So, I mean, just to pull this together, I mean, Urvashi, I mean, just hearing you work through this data, I think all of us have had experiences handing over other cards and other kind of KYC information to all kinds of contexts, right? From courier deliveries to banks and so on. And it's that kind of unregulated data flow that allows this context to emerge. If indeed this is something of an opportunity, I'm just going to invite both of you to just give us an example each from any of your work, whether you found a mode of communication that really works. I mean, what's worked for you? Is it the graphic novel? I think Urvashi mentioned a graphic novel. Is that does that travel well, or do you have a thought on this, Urvashi and then Asta?
We're grappling with the same question. As at Digital Futures Lab, we've been in a process where we've been trying to rethink or revisit what our theory of change is. When I started out in this business about 7 years ago, the theory of change was really about how do we shape policy. But that theory of change has shifted a lot. Or the need to shift that has become more apparent in the past couple of years for various reasons, right? Whether the tech is moving too fast or the incentives to regulate are just not in place, or whether there's this false binary between kind of regulation and innovation or whatever, for various reasons. And so what we've been thinking about is that, okay, look, while that kind of happens, or that slow train moves in its own kind of dynamic, how do we build kind of better public literacy and public education around this, which is not easy at all. And so the two things that we've been trying to do, one is, this graphic novel work where we try and take, kind of very similar to what you have done, right? Like take these high level conversations, convert them into something that is relatable, make it personal. I think the work that we want to do now is try and translate it into different languages. And we also see our own bias when we even when we do this storytelling, we see our kind of elite bias, even in that kind of storytelling. So to really kind of look wider for the relatable kind of stories. And the second piece that we've been trying to do is actually try and do more foresight work, which is to say that, can we try and think about what might be the unintended consequences of some of the decisions that we make today, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 15 years from now, and what does that kind of world look like? So if, for an example, we had a look into if we had a sense of what was coming when we accepted the kind of promise of social media, right, as democratizing access and making a large public square, and had we had that foresight muscle then, maybe we wouldn't have landed up in this space now, maybe it would have looked a little bit different. So how can we develop that kind of foresight muscle, both within civil society as well as policymakers, technology companies, so that we can start thinking a little bit ahead of what we're doing and what we're really making that trade-off for, right? Like what is the cost of our convenience today, and are we willing to bear that cost 5 years later when society looks very different?
Asta?
I think for us, it's also, again, the path has been very similar, and we've been experimenting recently with videos. So we actually, for the first time in a similar time frame as Urvashi mentioned, 7 years, that we will not have a report, but we will have a video, a movie from research. And also, so they're inspired by a former student, Abir, we've been making a little bit of trying to think of games as a way of embedding a lot of the research and making sure that it's playable, that it's tactile, and people can actually feel it, and make decisions that are not just sort of what they say out loud, but ones that they actually feel. So we've been experimenting a little bit with formats as well. So hopefully maybe there will be no reports and just some of these things that allow us to connect with each other.
Yeah, and maybe have more success than we had in the first round in 2017, writing long papers and reports. So let me thank Asta and Urvashi for joining us for this panel discussion, and for patient listeners for putting up with what we think, at least by my assessment, is an interesting and timely engagement with these questions as the AI the AI issues for one, and the kind of cyber fraud issues may reframe the way we think about privacy in India and beyond. So thank you very much, and you can find us at clpr.org.in, and our panelists are at their respective sites, which we will add to the show notes. And you can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and other social media handles. Thank you for joining us, and see you soon.